we need to like I'm working on my assignment, my cybersecurity assignment,
Sure.
and I have been told that it's due 7th of April.
Yeah, you have time on that. So 2 weeks is what I normally suggest. But obviously, you can look at more time if you need to do it because this is your first assignment, and the idea is to get it right. Because some of the things that you will do in this assignment will kind of become practices for you to follow through, in the subsequent assignments that you set. So
Yeah, and see.
not a problem. Not a problem on the timing. So I know that if I briefly just quickly look at the Moodle right now, I know that on the Moodle, essentially what you're going to see is that in this particular course, we have what is called five learning outcomes. And when we look at these five learning outcomes, we are looking at learning outcome three today, and there are a
Yeah.
couple of reading articles which are so. If you go down to this unit after cybersecurity, you have learning outcome three here, and obviously there are a couple of articles for each of the assessment criteria that we'll discuss, which are already available as PDF. So today's discussion is more about understanding the implication of changing technology, or when organizations switch over and change technology. For example, one of the major changes which happened was when Windows XP moved to Windows Vista then moved to Windows 10, and now you have Windows 11. So when you have these kind of major shifts, if an organization moves, like in our case, we moved from HubSpot CRM after 6.5, 7 years to Zoho CRM, that was a major change. So we will discuss what are the changes which happen, changes which can happen in organization with respect to technology, and how do these changes have an implication in terms of the workings and operations of the organization. That's the main part of the learning outcome. Now, the reason of also showing Moodle very quickly is that after this unit, what we are going to do is do another unit, which is Introduction to Digital Technologies. Now, these would essentially be more or less the three theoretical units which will be in this course. So, one is cybersecurity, the second one is emerging technologies, and the third one that you would see is primarily, what do you call digital technologies. After that, we are going to go into computing mathematics to help you develop some and refresh some of the bits on computing, which is related to logic, coding, and some programming, which is mathematical led. And then we will get on to things like introduction to web development, and then look at introduction to computer programming and mobile application development. So, introduction to web development will be done by Victor. I think computer programming by Victor. When we look at mobile applications, probably Henry or Victor between the two. And then the last one, which is computing mathematics, would be either Humza or it'll be Temi. So going forward, I would probably be looking at these are the three units which I normally teach. So after this, we will start, maybe give a break of 1 week to allow you to finish, or 1 or 2 weeks to allow you to finish the assignment, for emerging technologies, and then we will
Yeah.
start digital technologies. After that, the schedule will be computing mathematics, and then one of the three units, which is specialist units like computer programming, mobile app development, and web development. So this will,
Yeah.
I will reorder this, just after the session today. So what you will essentially see is in the introduction of the course. After that, you will see cybersecurity. Then you will see what you call emerging technologies. Then you will see digital technologies, and then computation mathematics. And then after that, web programming, website development, computer programming, and app development. So it will flow in that order. And that is to just to let you know that this is how we are looking at going forward for the coverage of the units.
Yeah. Interesting.
Okay, good stuff. So what we are going to look at is I've got Gartha also, which has joined. That's great. So we will make a start. I've got two of you in any case. So Daniel and another Daniel. Hopefully, I messaged them. They should be able to join and start with us. Now, today's learning outcome, as I mentioned, it's all about change. So we are looking at understanding why change happens, how change happens, but most of the discussion that we're going to do is going to be related to understanding change in terms of technology. So technological change is what we are going to be focused on when we look at actually looking at this learning outcome, three. There are no merit and distinction criteria in this. So it is purely a theoretical learning outcome because how do you see that? And how do you recognize that? Is because if you look at the learning outcome command verb here, it says understand. So that means it's knowledge based. You need to read, you need to understand it, understand any theoretical frameworks in it, and they would then be applied in terms of covering the assessment criteria. Say, for example, the next learning outcome we look at being able to research. That means we will have to practically look at doing it and put this into a bit of action in terms of understanding not just theoretical part of it, but also showing the application part of it. So most of the learning outcomes in the unit are essentially understand, which is knowledge based. Only this one, which is research, we will be looking at. So there will be a small mini kind of a project to look at from a point of view of understanding why research is important, and this is something that we'll look at picking up tomorrow. So in
Yeah.
today's criteria, we are looking at explaining the need for change. We need to understand why change happens in the organization first, and that too with regards to technological change. So why do organizations look at changing technology? For example, you might move from Windows to Mac. You might look at implementation of an antivirus software. You might look at implementation of a new software within the organization, or in some cases, in order to increase productivity, efficiency, and also look at scalability. This is the third term that I will introduce, is that when we look at changing technology, we also look at scalability. That means the technology that you are introducing or technological change that you are introducing, because of which the organization will benefit in either operational aspects or in terms of when I say operational aspects, what does that mean? Increasing efficiency, productivity, connectivity, and in some cases it will be looking at strategic objectives. And in such cases, when change is introduced, we need to look at classifying or shortlisting technology on the basis of its future prospects, and that is where we will need to look at understanding change. Now, in some cases, sometimes change when it is introduced, we don't have everyone, buying that change. That means not everybody is happy with that change. And when you look at, that change being introduced, some people have, or some employees, staff, contractors, suppliers might have resistance to that change. That means they're not happy. They're not wanting to relearn or train. And obviously, in some cases, processes, policies, and standard operating procedures have to be rewritten, amended, and in some cases sometimes you have to carry out what is called the impact analysis. And the impact analysis is primarily done to understand, if we are to look at making this change, then how would this be implemented within the organization. So one, the change introduction has to be assessed in terms of understanding which employees, staff, partners, or people within the organization are accepting the change, where there is resistance to accepting that change, where could be the issues and problems that could arise, who are the key stakeholders. And in some cases, what we also need to clearly then outline is defining objective scopes and timelines to be able to introduce that change so that it is not sudden. Sometimes you have big changes happening in the organization in terms of technology. You would normally have what is called a cross-functional team or a project team or a pilot team, which will be created. And these teams have the overarching, responsibility of ensuring that everybody integrates, understands, and is able to go along with the change which is happening in the organization. So we'll understand the change impact analysis matrix, or go into details of understanding it via a template or an example. And this is normally project based. The third one we are looking at is how does change affect people? So as I mentioned to you, sometimes people have resistance, or they are not very forthcoming to accepting change because it means a steep learning curve for them. It means reinventing some of the processes and wheels part of it. And in such cases, what could be the reasons why employees or staffs or contractors or external contractors working for the organization are not happy to embrace that change? We look at that in learning out assessment criteria 3. The next part, which talks about methods of implementing change. So how is change introduced in the organization? There is a set specific method and model that we look at in terms of how change is done. There are two models in particular from a theoretical perspective that we can look at. One is the leave-in change model, which is unfreezing, and then making the change, 3-step process. And there is also a Cotter's model of change, which is an 8-step model of change, which is proposed by Cotter. And in such cases, sometimes organizations, depending on their size, scale, and operation of their business, assuming if a change is being introduced and the organization has presence in 10 countries or 20 countries, then that change is phased out in a way wherein implementation of that is done in a phased out manner. And because there are lots of employees, lots of equipment, lots of processes across different geographies, then in such cases, organizations choose to implement this change in a very systematic way. And in some cases, what they would be doing is to implement and introduce that change. They will use a particular model, and we'll look at one or two such models. The last one talks about considerations which you need to make, in IT technologically, when we look at introducing IT change, what could be the adaptations which the organization essentially looks at in order to introduce that change so that the process through which the company, employee, organization goes through is successful. And in such cases, you would look at, formation of cross-functional teams to aid in this process of change, and also look at training and development, look at developing new processes, user manuals, or for example, operating procedures which would allow people undergoing that change or embracing that change to understand those processes. And it is like a trouble guide or a troubleshoot book or a guide that you create, so that if people end up having any problems, issues, bugs, or errors, then they can look at doing that troubleshooting using that particular guide. And that is what typically would be considered, in terms of before that change is introduced. So quite a theoretical outcome, which basically focuses predominantly on change and introduction, and basically the introduction of change within the organization, and focuses on understanding some of the theoretical models. Because when we look at these theoretical models, they tend to be the same, because irrespective of the sector or the industry that you're in, these change models or some of the theoretical models can still be applied across various sectors. So in such case, what we are looking at is understanding, theoretically from a change perspective, these change models. Now, how do you look at a couple of things? So when we look at starting this learning outcome, one of the things that I would suggest is to look at understanding what is the definition of technological change. So when we do talk about technological change, what we are looking at primarily is the company is introducing this part of the process to better the technology or improve the technology, in order to ensure that the organization is able to meet its goal. Now, give you an example. In the early 1990s, most organizations, when they had to produce what are called printed documents, the mode of printing of those documents used to be typewriters, right? So typewriters had to be used to create legal documentation or any sort of such documentation which was required to be sent out. Let's, for example, look at press release. A company wants to send out a press release. A copy of that press release had to be typed out using a typewriter. So you could imagine, if you can, that how long would it take for somebody to write out that press release, not handwritten, not using calligraphy, but using typewriters to be able to write that. Now, when it was typewriters were available, you could type that out, and if photocopiers were available, that same copy of that press release could be photocopied using a typewriter, using a photocopier, and you don't need to type that again. So from an organizational perspective, if we were to move you from typewriter to a computer when they were introduced in late 90s, it allowed production of these documents electronically, and you could email them, you could print them out, and that meant that you had to write once and then use it multiple times. You could create copies quite easily. Now, this was or can be seen as a technological shift, because companies which had typewriters went out of business because computers started to coming in. They started to become affordable, and companies started to invest in this kind of an equipment, because they really felt that this is a change. It will improve productivity. It will obviously increase the output, and certain tasks which are repetitively done within the organization would make it easier for us to reproduce and use that material. So this change of introduction of computers and replacing typewriters in the organization would have meant that a lot of people would have had to start understanding how computers are to be used. They would require training or maybe some sort of a course that they had to get onto to be able to start using computers. And they would have had a bit of resistance because people who were in the, say for example, people who were like old enough, like in the 40s, they would not have liked that change because they were let's say, familiar with the QWERTY format. So when we look at typewriter and today's keyboards that you still look at follow what is called the typewriter format. So if you look at the first keys on your keyboard, QWERTY, it's called the QWERTY format. Now, the
Yeah.
way you type, and if you look at people over the years when they started becoming the use of typewriters in the 80s and 90s became quite consistent with the use of organization and literature and production of content. People used to do a course called shorthand, and that shorthand course on typewriting used to allow them to increase their typing speed because there was a format invented for the keyboard which was QWERTY, and the shorthand essentially allowed them to take notes. So secretaries or PAs or personal executive assistants or executive assistants, needed to have on their CV a qualification which was called shorthand, and that allowed them to quickly take notes. Clerks in the legal profession were required to take notes. People sitting or clerks sitting in the parliament, for example, or government offices were required to take minutes of the meeting, and they had a requirement that they should be able to speak and sorry, they should be able to take notes in shorthand. And that was a example of some sort of a requirement which was created when you were applying for a job. So when this shift started to happen, obviously the shorthand, if you were taking dictation and things like that, were required. But with the coming in of dictaphones, which meant that you could actually record the speech or record the conversation, and that then can be taken by the secretary to type out the minutes, was possible. Now, if you look at that as a process, and today we look at the use of AI, if you look at Otter AI or you look at some of the AI attachments which are available in your browser, in Zoom meeting, we use one, they are able to automatically take minutes of the meeting. And that is a technological shift and a change which has happened. So if you look at from the 80s typewriter to computer in the early 90s, then to, for example, some sort of softwares being available which allowed people to take notes, which is shorthand, and today the use of AI to be able to, or in between dictaphone, which was used to record conversations, and today you use AI and AI assisted softwares to be able to do this part of, say, enabling automatic minutes of the meeting to happen, is essentially what is called, a technological change. So adapting to those changes which are happening in this context, some people will like it, some people will not like it, some people will find it difficult to adapt because they feel there is a learning curve and they would require training. It might mean that their speed at which they currently pick up that process might be slow. Over a point in time, as you make it a habit, you start using it more and more, your speed and your understanding of that usage would enable you to be more productive and increase your output. But you would generally see this is how a technological change happens when we talk about change. Now, another example that I would give you is sometimes changes also happen because of new inventions or modernization of technology which can happen. And that would mean a new invention means something new has been introduced. Innovation means something new in terms of a version for what is already in existence has actually been created. Now, sometimes innovations can be treated as first time introductions, but once they've been introduced, there are continuous changes which are done in that product or in that service, which keeps it continuously improving and making it faster, better, more reliable, scalable, whatever it is. And then when you look at this as a process where inventions and innovations happen, another example that I will give you is in the if you look at between 2005 to 2008, you had BlackBerry more or less ruling the market. So they had a phone which was a keypad based phone. It allowed texting to be easier, and obviously to a certain extent emailing or emailing as a function which was introduced in these smartphones got became a runaway hit with corporate or business side of the market, because they were able to text quite quickly, they were able to exchange messages and send emails. But look at the introduction of the iPhone when it happened. It turned that keyboard into a touch screen. And when that turning phase happened in the technology, we would classify it as what is called an innovation. That means a new type of product which was invented, which did away with the keyboard input, and it turned that input into a screen or a touch based input. And that was, I would say, an innovation in this sector in terms of telecommunication, but also an invention, because there were very little or very few such products available which had touchpad or touch screen enabled inputs available on the phone. Now, when this happened, it obviously changed the industry, because there's a whole new ecosystem which started to come about. The applications changed, and people could suddenly use the phone not just for you know sending text, but emails, and they could take photographs, they could do a voice call. And over a point in time, when they introduced FaceTime or video calling on the phone, excuse me, that revolutionized the telecom sector, because that was not just an innovation but an invention, because the invention of the iPhone or touchscreen based phones allowed further innovations in the product to happen. So things like FaceTime was introduced. Later on, they started to introduce what is called the App Store. That means new kind of applications. And then multitasking was possible on the phone for the first time. When you had Blackberries and you had Nokias and LGs and Samsungs, they were basically voice phones and texting phones. Either you could text or you could have a call, but you couldn't do parallel functions together. But with the introduction of this smartphone, which was touchscreen based, it allowed not just applications to run parallelly, but it allowed multitasking also to happen. And what we see over the years now as an outcome of the introduction of the iPhone is that the handheld cameras have disappeared. Digital handheld cameras have totally disappeared. So the best camera in your hand is your phone, and people now take photographs with phones. Obviously, they're able to email it, upload it to a social media network, and share it on various kind of messaging apps. All that can be done instantly while having a phone call, sending an email, and all that stuff. So when we look at technological change, this is a change which was introduced from an industry perspective. And a lot of consumers adopted it, and it became a runaway hit as the time has passed and as people started to understand the benefits of using the iPhone, and it started to replace. So you see Nokia pretty much disappearing from the market, digital cameras pretty much disappearing and have disappeared from the market, and companies like BlackBerry and others have totally gone, marginalized and bankrupt, although they have phones which are available, but very few people buy them. Now,
Yeah.
this is where we need to understand that when such changes are introduced, we see them as consumer. But in companies, when you see it, or in businesses, you see it as IT administrator, these changes have significant impacts. And these impacts can be felt on output, efficiency, productivity, processes, scalability, and in general also have a impact on the costing and the finances of the organization. So that is what it is what we are going to look at in today's learning outcome, because we need to understand what is technological change, how it is introduced, what kind of an impact it has on the users, and last but not the least, how this change is gradually phased in or introduced within a business or an organization, so that users, in this case, employees, partners, customers, are able to embrace that change and see that as a positive aspect of why this has been done, because it increases efficiency, output, and productivity at different levels in terms of stakeholders. But at the same time, it also increases also allows the organization to increase and adapt to its goals and mission, that the I would say the let's say the objectives is the organization needs to achieve. So every company is looking at being more efficient. Another example that I will quickly give, which can be related, is that when e-commerce as a business started to become mainstream, that means people became comfortable with using the internet. Over the years, then internet became more secure and companies started to sell products online. Now today you see a lot of different kind of products which are available. A lot of companies are selling online. If they don't have a presence, they miss out on business and they are losing customers. An example of that I would give you is there are companies like Amazon and in the UK in particular, if I give that example, these companies started introducing and selling products online through their Amazon store, a couple of years back. When I say couple, I would say, I would say 2026, 2025, sorry, 2005, 6, 7 onwards, you started to see the increase of usage of, people buying online. Now, there were companies like Tesco, John Lewis, they always focused on selling and interacting with customers in store. But what we see is companies which took the first mover advantage of creating comprehensive e-commerce stores, selling the products online, actually realized a lot of benefits. Or what were the benefits? If we were to think and put some of them in discussion, a lot of companies were looking at cutting costs. Where they were looking at cutting costs, they were looking at cutting costs on manpower, inventory, warehousing, transportation, storage. And what they felt was this model, if you see, originally was started by Dell Computers. They started to create a model which basically shook the industry because previous to that, you had companies like Lenovo, Acer, IBM, Compaq, a lot of other computing companies, Hewlett Packard. They were producing computers and they were selling it through the traditional brick and mortar route. That means people would go to their shop, the brand showrooms, buy the computers and things. Dell came out, Michael Dell, when he launched the business, he came out with the idea of build to configure. That means you could actually go onto the website, choose and configure your model, and the computer would arrive in 3 days from the time that you paid for that on the website. Now that started to revolutionize and shake the industry because that was a big technological change introduced by a competitor. And to a certain extent, it was innovative because nobody was looking at selling computers wherein the consumers can actually customize it. I want this much of video RAM, I want this much of memory, I want this much of hard drive, I want this size of monitor, this kind of keyboard. And all these options were not possible with traditional companies. When Dell came out with that model, they had a bit of a resistance in the market. But when people started to understand the benefits of it in terms of faster shipping, cheaper prices, and the ability to be able to control and configure product the way you wanted, it started to become a hit. And what then later happened was a lot of other companies started to follow suit. They obviously continued selling the models and their products through the channel, but what it also eminently meant is that if they could not address and have a e-commerce store online, that would mean that they would lose significant amount of customers to Dell Computing. Now that change, if you look at applying to other places, given an example of Tesco, John Lewis, Sainsbury's, some of these companies did not have an online presence. But when you look at companies like Argos, when you look at companies which are predominantly were selling like Amazon, they were selling products online. They were the clear winners when you look at, say, for example, during COVID, because that meant people could not go to the shops because of lockdowns, but they were able to buy still products online and the products were still getting delivered to your house. Now, this is a big technological change which some of them had to do or introduce because they had to play catch up. They did not have strong IT teams, they did not have servers or infrastructure, and they realized that why some of these companies are actually doing it is because of the fact that these companies are enjoying benefits in terms of savings on inventory, warehousing,
Efficiency.
just in time kind of production, which could be used, and efficiencies of supply chain and logistics. You could actually ship the material directly from where it is being produced to the customer because there's an order for it, and you do not need to keep that in inventory, assuming that an order will come from the customer. So it led to significant amount of savings for the company. And as product and product choices have, become more and more available to consumers, like on the phone, or for example, if you look at a product like shoe that you buy, sportswear shoes that you buy, Nike has over, I think, 500 different types of shoes. Now, if they start to keep 500 different types of shoes in stock and it doesn't sell, what will they do with the inventory? So some of the products are exclusively sold online on the online stores, because if you get the order, you get a delivery in 3 to 5 working days. So these are things which companies had to adapt because they were embracing online sales, and e-commerce stores had to be created. And this is a big technological change because sometimes some companies had to employ people because they did not have the manpower with the trained resources already available to be able to work on these technological changes. So a lot of companies had to create IT departments, look at infrastructure investments, and also look at recruiting manpower which were IT savvy and very competent in terms
Yeah.
of dealing with this.
Yeah.
So when this shift happens at the top level. The CEO or the top management or the board of the company will actually say, okay, we are losing a significant part of our sales to online, and this is going to our competitors. We don't have a presence. And in such cases, a decision is taken, and the board and the company management decides that, okay, yes, we would need to have an online presence, and that allows the company to move and shift into that gear to start developing those processes, getting those infrastructure in place, hiring the manpower required and resources, and that requires investment. But when we look at it from an overall point of view, this is how it will happen. But focus would be to look at what is the impact on technology and how that technology, when brought into the organization, enables the organization to run more smoothly, streamlines a certain part of the operation, leads to cost savings and efficiencies, and in general means that the organization is now attracting revenue from a different stream which it had not planned for or foreseen, and that requires that big change to happen within the organization. Now, that gives you hopefully a bit of a background in terms of the overarching information on what do we need to look at in this learning outcome. Now, there's a video which is on YouTube, which I've shortlisted here. And this video is basically a short video which summarizes the learning outcome in a way that it gives you a perspective and an example of understanding what is technological change in particular, what is the definition of it, what are the advantages of introducing such changes in the organization, how can it impact the organization, and then what are the benefits the organization gets by introducing that change if everybody is able to embrace it and go along with it by taking an example. So I would suggest strongly to watch this particular video because this would be in a way giving you a nutshell overview of the learning outcome, like I've explained using the example of Dell Technologies or Amazon, for example. Now, let's go into some of the assessment criteria. So the first one that we are looking at is talking about the need for change. Now, obviously, over the years, if we look at understanding broadly, the concept of change, there are lots of changes which have happened over the years in terms of things that we look at within the industry in general. Now, when we do look at the process of change, what we are looking at is these changes typically happen because there are, for example, three main reasons: innovation happening, invention happening, and then last but not the least, which was, things which look at from a point of view of diffusion. That means sometimes changes happen very quickly and people need to adapt.
Yeah.
They do not anticipate the changes coming in the market or changes coming in the processes, but they need to be able to adapt to those because that has happened because of structural shift in how people do things, or how does the market do things in general when it comes to business and trade. But when we look at the need for change within organization, it arises because of a lot of internal and external factors. And these internal and external factors can be factors which can affect the business positively or negatively. So when we do look at internal factors, they could be SWOT analysis. For example, the company might need to introspect and look at what are its strengths and weaknesses. And if the company wants to expand, what are the opportunities and threats it faces if it expands into a particular market. A simple example that I'll give you here, just for context purposes, if Amazon decides today to get into, for example, today it is in music, it is in shopping online, it also has its Amazon, video service, and it has lots of other services also available. But today, for example, if Amazon decides that I want to go into launching, stores, which they've done, stores like Amazon Go, which are, being trialed out in New York and London and some of the major cities. It is trying to get into what is called a brick and mortar retail market. Now, there would be internal reasons it analyzes why it thinks it needs the stores, and external factors, why do you think it needs to go into a store? Or look at another example. We have Mercedes, which basically produces consumer cars. But if it suddenly decides that, okay, I want to start producing motorcycles, or it decides that I'll go into it producing something else, now, there
Yeah.
would be some analysis which the company needs to do internally to see what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, why do you think it is a good decision for the company to look at starting manufacturing of motorcycles and things like that. And externally, it will look at factors like market, growth in the market, demand from the consumer. And in such cases, the businesses, in order to remain competitive and obviously look at sustained growth from a long term perspective, and also to meet customer demands, they will need to go into this particular line of business. Now, in such cases, this is a change which they are doing because they are moving from what they are traditionally doing to something which is going to be new to the organization. Now, this change which is introduced, or if they introduce, hypothetically speaking, will also be then driven by some key drivers, which are going to be market pressures, for example, consumer demand, technological advancements, some of their internal strengths, which is going to be things like they're able to produce engines and manufacture them. They have trained manpower and staff, and also looking at understanding the market for the future. So if 20 years down the line, if everything moves to, for example, hydrogen-based vehicles or hybrid, fuel cell vehicles, things like that. And if they are not in the electric vehicles market and not producing models, their business will start to get impacted. They will start losing business consumers because the government regulation, the legislation requirements from a customer perspective, they're all changing, but they are not recognizing these changes. So when we look at change in general, changes can happen because of lots of reasons. It could be, if I summarize, market expectations, consumer expectation, technological shifts which are happening in the market, or innovation which is happening in that sector, and last but not the least, regulatory and legal changes which the governments or organizations are required to follow, which are being introduced. And in such cases, change in the organization, or technological change specifically, if I add that word, becomes a necessity, because it becomes necessary for the organization to introduce and embrace that change, because it is required for sustainability, growth of the organization, and for the future success of the organization in the sector in which they are competing. Now, if they do not see this happening and do not evolve or do not embrace that change, that means start understanding why this is required and then employing that change within the organization, then you would see the organizations would become defunct. They would fade away with time and history. And we see many
Yeah.
of such organizations, like example I've given you of typewriter companies. Look at BlackBerry, look at Nokia. These
Yeah.
companies have faded away because they did not realize that the market is changing. Some innovation or innovative product and technology has come in. They did not change fast enough. And because they did not embrace and move with the times, changing times, and introduce technology to embrace that change, they today are no longer present in the market. You look at Kodak, the cameras,
Yeah.
largest producer of film reels and rolls, they have gone away because they didn't realize that digital cameras were coming in integrated into the phone. They did not introduce products or look at what they would need to do as a company to survive. And that's why you see these companies actually fading away. Now, on the slides, what I've put is there have been major changes which have happened over the centuries. So, one big change was the Industrial Revolution that we generally talk about. The second wave of industrial revolution is modernization, which started to happen post World War II era. So you had the mass production of products started to happen in factories. So the industrial revolution was, maybe Thomas Edison created the bulb in 1890, light bulb. You look at Graham Bell introducing the telephone. But obviously, what has happened over the years is that if you look at 20, 30, 40, 50 years back, a couple of centuries, some couple of decades after that, there were further innovations in those products. And that allowed these products or these technologies or services to be mass produced for consumers. So industrial revolution maybe led to a lot of inventions of product and services, but industrialization, which happened primarily as a second phase in after World War II, allowed these inventions to become what are called household, allowed them to become, I would say, mass produced, and then they were started to be used in households. So things like washing machines, microwaves, TVs. You look at, for example, the use of electricity and other such inventions which happened in the industrial revolution actually started to be utilized in homes, and that is where the demand suddenly started to surge. So when we look at changes happening, industrial revolution is one of them. You have the industrialization as the second one, and then over the years what has happened with industrialization is that commercialization has also happened. That means mass production of everything and innovations and inventions happening in that category. So an example that I would give you here for you to understand is you had TVs being introduced, but they were cathode ray TVs, CRT TVs or screens. Slowly and gradually, we had the invention of plasma, then it came to LCD, then it came to LED. Today we have OLED, and then when we look at resolution, you had 720p, 480p, 720, 1080p, which is HD, as we call it, high definition. Now, today, the high definition is 4K. Companies in Japan and some other companies like Sony and others have also introduced 8K televisions. And as you see, broadcasting, which is changing, what is happening is the format of broadcasting is changing from standard definition SD to high definition, which is there. But today, TV channels and influencers on Instagram, TikTok are producing, show reels and videos on what is called high definition 4K and even 8K. And then this is where innovation is happening in the same field. So television is not new, but the
Yeah.
way you look at television screen, they are shrinking from being a big, part of the room to a smaller part that you can hang on the wall just like a photo frame. Now, this is
Yeah.
all technological change. Now, initially it meant that a lot of consumers were not able to buy plasma because plasmas were being sold as you can see more black, the black is a black, and you can see more variation of colors. And the plasma technology allowed televisions to move from cathode ray tubes to smaller versions in terms of square that you could hang on the wall.
Yeah.
But what has happened is it was not affordable initially in technology wise. A plasma television would have costed five, six, seven, $8,000 for a 40-inch or a 32-inch. But as in technology was commercialized, a mass production started, what you see the prices coming down. So prices today for a plasma television, obviously plasma is no longer being bought, but if you look at plasma went to LCD, then LCD went to, they became lightweight and obviously started to become bigger screens. So price has gone down. Today you can buy a 32-inch OLED television for £129. So can you imagine people who spent $9,000 on a television in 2010 to buy, and today they can buy something of a similar size in 129, is because of commercialization of technology. So changes have
Yeah.
been introduced over the years, which lead to product innovation and inventions. Slowly and gradually, commercialization comes in, which means starts to become more affordable. The demand increases, and then what tends to happen is you would see mass production happening, and that means the prices, consumer demand of it goes down, consumer demand increases, and that means mass production allows these products to become more affordable for more consumers. Now, these are things that we look at from a point of view of change, because obviously people are wanting better televisions, larger screens, more energy efficient models, cheaper pricing, and that could be explained in the case of television that I took as an example. from a technological perspective, that why there is a need for change. Why do scientists, researchers, and technology enthusiasts keep looking at bringing out new technologies and inventions? Because there is a need for change. People want today bigger televisions, which are more energy efficient, which are essentially having more functions. So today you have smart TVs. They can connect to the internet. But this was not something thought of 20 years back. But because internet
Yeah.
is fast available, fast broadband and internet is available, people can no longer want to use PC for connecting to the internet. While they're browsing TV, they want to connect to the internet. So somebody thought of it. Somebody then went into research as a company, introduced this, patented the technology, and then finally, once it started to become available, it has been mass produced.
Yeah.
There are lots of examples that you can choose and look at why there is a need for change. If you look at why Apple introduced the iPod, you know, if I grew up with a Walkman, I don't know how many of you heard about Sony Walkman. I had a Sony Walkman, which was a cassette player
Yeah.
that I could hang,
Yeah.
on my belt using a clip, and I could listen to music while I was on the go and put headphones on. And that is how I grew up
Yeah.
as a teenager. Now, today,
Yeah.
if you ask
When I
my
was young.
kids, yeah, and today, if you ask my kids, they probably don't even use the iPod or anything like that. They say it is on my phone, I don't need it. So when you look
Yeah.
at these kind of things, these are innovations. So when Steve Jobs introduced the iPod, he always said that I always listened to music while I was working, and I always had this idea that how could I fit 1,000 songs or more into a particular player, because I had to continuously change cassettes, and when I was listening to music or something, it could only have 60 minutes or 30 minutes of music, but I wanted to listen to more. So he looked at this innovation with his product team and looked at saying that, okay, let's produce a product which will allow music to be stored on a hard drive. And they introduced the iPods initially. So in the early 2000, when he introduced the iPod, it became a runaway hit because suddenly you could compress and have and carry 1,000 songs in your pocket without having to recharge it for 12 hours or 15 hours and continuously listen to music. Now, this was innovation and invention. Invention wasn't really a major part of it because music and you being able to play music on the go was already available through Walkman and CD players and things like that. But the
MP3s.
invention was bringing that down into a small device which was battery powered and had 10 times or 100 times the capacity of storing songs to be able to work on it. And that is where he realized that this is a change that we need to introduce. And this change allowed the music industry to change altogether. You look at what
Yeah.
Spotify did in the late, 20 after 2015. So music is available to anybody free of cost, but it is supported and I would say paid for through advertising. So when you listen to Spotify, you have a paid account. You don't have advertising in it, but if you have a free account, that means that you are listening to music, but also in between there is advertising happening, which allows the consumers to listen to free music. And a couple of days back, it was in the news that Spotify as a company paid out $7.7 billion as royalty to artists and music companies around the world. And this is showing you how a company has embraced change and introduced a business model in which now they are not just making revenue, but they have revolutionized the industry by allowing artists to directly get connected to consumers, cutting out the middlemen. And this is an example of how organizations look at introducing change, embracing change, and in some cases, these are in new business models which organizations have created, thereby allowing consumers to get more access and I would say choice in terms of how they want to consume music. So, this first assessment criteria, need for change, can be explained through various ways. One, change of requirements from consumer side, regulatory changes, evolving customer preferences in terms of how consumers want to look at using that service, technological advancements, and sometimes creation of new business models because the market has allowed these business models to be created where thereby new businesses and new type of business models are able to reach and make this service or product available to consumers. Is that okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've
So
taken
much
a number.
nostalgia.
Yeah. So I've taken a
Yeah.
couple of examples on the slides to give you a bit of a different perspective, which, and you can use some of these to be able to understand and obviously go into more detailing of why sometimes, changes are required and why they are introduced within the organization. Now, if we are to look at carrying out a change, first thing that we need to be able to do is basically look at understanding how this change will impact the business model. Businesses, as an owner, they would look at that, management would look at that, and then in some cases, you would also look at what kind of impact would it have primarily for your consumers. Now, if you introduce something which customers are not ready to buy or not ready to introduce, what will happen is it will backfire. And that would mean,
Yeah.
although the product is innovative, the service is good, but essentially customers will stop using it because they do not feel that they can connect to this change. And in such cases, it can be detrimental for the organization from a business perspective. So, when a change is to be introduced, most companies typically would look at a change impact analysis as a process that they will carry out to understand the potential consequences of the proposed change. Right now, what they would want to do and the methodology behind this would be that they would want to look at how this change can be introduced, can be accepted. There is a rationale behind introducing this change. And last but not the least, this will reduce the risk and allow them to, I would say, allow them to, I would say, allow their
Increase
customers
efficiency.
to essentially accept that change. Now, when this happens, an organization would conduct what is called a change impact analysis, and that can be done in many very different ways. One could be operational impact. That, okay, as a technology, if I want to look at a technological change, then first thing that we want to look at is how does it affect operations of an organization. Now, operational impact refers to changes that could be introduced in processes, procedures, and thereby they will finally affect the performance of the organization. That means day to day activities. One of the things that you look at is, for example, as a lot of companies started to employ a lot of people, over the years, what they wanted to do was in the organization, they wanted to introduce technology to be able to increase efficiency of people working within factories and offices. Now, in order to do so, a shift which I've already explained, when it happened from typewriters to computers, but when computers came in, obviously, if you had a faster computer, your employee is going to be more productive, right? If you have a slow
Yeah.
computer and a slow processing power or a smaller monitor, the employee would be slow in terms of creating the output or doing the work. So, if I look at a very simple example of computer and what kind of computer or equipment you have, and if the equipment is slow, outdated, not up to the mark in terms of meeting requirements of applications, you generally feel that the employee's output would be affected, and that is affecting the operational side of the organization because efficiency or productivity or speed at which the output is to be produced is being affected. The second could be when you look at, say, for example, if the organization decides that, okay, we want to replace all the old computers. Now, example, an organization has maybe 10 employees. If it has to replace 10 Macs or 10 computers in the organization, then it could have a financial impact, which somebody in the finance team would look at. The CEO decide, okay, let's change all the computers. Now that decision is okay, but when it goes to finance, finance would say, okay, who is going to fund this change? Where is it going to come from? We don't have reserves, or they would come up with some options and alternatives to look at how this can be introduced. But they would calculate the cost that, okay, do we buy it on lease? Do we buy it on finance? Do we want to look at buying it outright? Does the company have enough profits to be able to buy this? And in such cases, what you would generally see is that they would need to look at the financial impact of it. So before the decision is implemented, a financial impact statement will also be created to say how much budget is required, what is the amount required to spend, and all those things will actually be coming into the change impact analysis. Now, the financial controller comes back and says, okay, changing each of them costs, say, £1,400. Changing 10 of them would mean that we'll be looking at spending £1,400 by 10, that is £14,000 as an expense. And then finance would give options to the management to say, we can lease the equipment, we can buy it on finance, we can buy it on EMI, and things like that, monthly stay EMI for 12 months. And that will help stagger the cost, but it will also help improve bringing the equipment in and improve the efficiency. So this would be the financial impact of it. Now, from an HR perspective, the HR would look at, for example, things like what does that mean for the employee? Now, is it a big change? Is it a change that means we need to do training? We need to look at skills enhancement. We need to look at, for example, levels at which they will need to go training. Because if it's a new equipment, new product, does the employee have the skills to be able to use it, or are you buying something which is going to be an overkill? That means it is quite advanced, and the employees do not have the knowledge and training and skills to be able to use it. So they would need to look at a bit of a analysis to see whether this would actually really impact the productivity and efficiency of the employee. Would it help it, or would it impede it, or would it basically mean that we will need to spend a bit more money on training, and then over a point in time, as they become comfortable with new technology, that would mean that increases in output and productivity.
Yeah.
Technologically, the IT department would need to look at now whether you're introducing 10 or 15 or 100 PCs. Does the company have the infrastructure and the capability to cope with it? For example, network bandwidth, internet requirement. Are there any integration issues? Are there any reliability issues that if you're buying something new in the from the market, is it reliable enough? And are there any security risks to the network? So those things, maybe technological side of things, the IT administration would look into it. And finally, what would be the result which is required? The result required would be, are there any negative effect of that technology? Is there going to be any, although we are all looking at positives, but is there a negative
Yeah.
output of that technology? So all this will need to be calculated before you look at, implementing and buying those 10 iMacs, or, changing of the pieces or whatever it is. So a change impact analysis would look at what are the potential impacts and what are the risks involved in embracing or bringing that new technology into the organization. And that would be something that you could look at it from a different perspective. Depending on the size and scale of organization, you might want to calculate financial impact, impact on employees from training perspective, operational efficiency impact, or in some cases, a technological impact. And one could be, for example, an organization was not having computers, everybody was doing manual work in a call center, for example, and everything was coming from the central computer. But if a decision is taking 200 computers is to be bought and installed on a floor, then one of the things that you will look at would be environmental impact. Is the energy
Yeah.
supply and the grid available in the building to be able to take and install 200 computers? And to a certain extent, is it going to be energy efficient? What would the impact on the bill, electricity bill, or the, those kind of things would also be looked at from an administration perspective. And all
Yeah.
these things
Also
have
that
to be considered.
yeah. Yeah, also the fact that people are different. Sometimes people they are not ready to accept change.
Correct.
They are not ready to learn something new, or they're not used to learning something like that has to do with technology. They're not interested in technology, maybe, for example.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that brings us to the next point, because what we are looking at is we need to understand how can people, how this introduction of technology or change within the organization, specifically from a technological perspective, can affect people. So when we look at the introduction of new technology, first part is we could look at what are the reasons why a company wants to introduce this. So as I mentioned, there could be internal and external pressures or factors affecting the organization. But generally, when changes in technology are introduced in the organization or a business, they tend to be because it's external factors which are affecting it. That means the competition is moved to that platform, or this particular implementation of technology done by the competition gives them an edge, or more a competitive edge over us as a company and our products and services. So in such cases, it could be pressure that they are looking at innovating, because these upgrades which the competitor has done, which is external to their organization, allows them to reach out to the customers much more quickly and efficiently. And our customers are feeling that they do not have the same advantage. A simple example I would give you here is if a company introduces AI, for example, for dealing with customer complaints, it is able to deal with the customer complaints quite quickly. They have automated the voice calling system. They've automated and created a knowledge base, which essentially allows the customers to troubleshoot the problems, raise a ticket, and that all happens to the website. Now, this is one company's perspective because they are wanting to offer this as a innovative way to deal with complaints of their customers and quickly resolve them, which is obviously over a point in time proving to be more successful because customers are happy, the company's sales are increasing, and because the consumer confidence is rising, that if we have problems, then they are able to solve it very quickly and efficiently. That would mean this company would be winning more market share or increasing its sales as against their other competitors. Now, other competitors are on telephone calling and usual methods of emailing, but they are slow because how many call agents can you have in your company, whether this services between working hours of 9 to 5, whereas with the AI that is 24/7 and as many number of customers can actually be serviced. But in this case, if you have two people in the customer service or four people in the customer service as an example, that would mean they can only deal with three or four customers at one point in time, and the solution and the resolution they offer might take time because they have not implemented some of the technological changes which their competitor has done with the use of AI. So in such cases, you would see that it can affect how change can be introduced within the organization. Now, when we look at this, it can have lots of different reasons and ways through which it can affect, people. One could be emotional impact. One
Yeah,
second could be behavioral impact. Third could be, it could have impacts from a point of view of creating stress and pressure because they are, because the solution to the problems are not being found very quickly. That is creating a bit of a backlog, and that backlog is essentially creating stress and pressure on the management and obviously on the company to be able to resolve these complaints. Just following through that example. So, in such cases, when you look at these kind of reasons why change has to be taken, is because it is to do with external factors, and these external factors would be competition adapting change or new technology. It could be competition introducing something in the market which you do not have. And that is why companies need to follow suit to be able to have the same advantage or similar offerings as compared to others in the market. And these are generally done, from a point of view of why these are done is primarily because of external factors. This change which is normally introduced is done primarily to speed up decision making. This decision making can be speeded up if there is a process which has changed. Like I've given a simple example here of, if you want to buy a car, the first thing that you would do when you decide to buy a car is, there are lots of different brands available, lots of different models available. The first thing that as a consumer your website would be able to do is, they will ask you what type of car you want, and they'll have a questionnaire, and that questionnaire could be a visual questionnaire. Right, that questionnaire would be what type of car you're buying. You're buying a sedan, a passenger vehicle. You're buying a 4x4. You want to buy a cabriolet, or a sports car, whatever it is, or a 4x4 Jeep kind of version. Now, when you choose that, it'll show you further products. Then it'll say what engine do you want, petrol or diesel. Then it'll go into further detailing as an example. Now, if the company is
yeah,
able to create this questionnaire on the website, and assuming some of the other companies are still doing it by phone and asking customers to come to the showroom and discuss this, you look at how much time is it going to waste from a point of view of helping the customer to make a decision. But if this process was automated and put on the website where customers will go visually, just quickly look at the car models and click on it, and then finally look at saying, okay, this is what I want, and then pick up the phone and speak, you would see that company would actually get more customers and more inquiries as compared to somebody that they need to pick up and call. Okay, I have the models listed on the website, but these models do not explain or the process of rational of decision making. So in such cases, use of technology to create those questionnaires and those in the visual form would be more beneficial because they would attract more consumers. More consumers would come to the website, look at that option, and then get in touch for the inquiry or for for the sales part of thing. So this change, if the company does not introduce, if anybody else has introduced in the market, like Mercedes introduced it, but Audi and BMW and Volkswagen haven't done this, they will start realizing that this is a change they need to make because they are not getting enough inquiries. Suddenly the sales have gone down. The graph in terms of sales over a period of 3 months, 6 months will start to decline. And more and more customers will start going to a site wherein they find it easier to do this. And because the models and pricing is competitive, that would mean the company would start losing business. So if they do not embrace this change, do not bring this change and understand how it is affecting the company and the business of the organization, then they would fail and over a point in time they would start losing and having an impact on the financial side. So that is why what we need to look at is that companies look at making this change, and they can make this change in order to look at increasing business, in order to ensure that it helps its consumers to be able to look at building a better relationship and obviously increasing sales of their products. Is that okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, that looks at bringing us to a task which talks about how change can be implemented, right? Now, when we look at change, this is the theoretical models that we need to understand. Over the last couple of years, there have been two specific models of change which have been proposed, and they are now widely accepted in the market as standard models of how change can be introduced in the organization. So one of the models that I mentioned earlier was the John Cotter's change model. It's an 8-step model which talks about the organization going by doing its analysis to understand the urgency, why this has to be introduced as a change. They look at the reasons of change. They look at how this would help the organization. So going from step 1 to 3, how this change or introduction of this change would help the organization in meeting its long-term objectives. They look at communicating this change and a plan for that change with the management. The management will further break it down into a workable or an operational plan. The operational plan will further be broken down into a tactical plan so that all employees in the organization understand this. And at various levels of that planning, there would be points or actions put in place which will allow decision making to happen so that the head of the department can decide, okay, who all will be the employees who will become, would be involved in this change, how would the training happen, what budget would be required. So delegation and decision making power would be empowered by the management when this change starts to happen in the organization. Then at some stage, it will be introduced first in a part of the organization to see whether everything is working. And if it is working, then it will be introduced across the organization. And if there are feedback, there is a process in which feedback is required to be taken. So continuous feedback is taken by the company when the change is being introduced in order to ensure that adapting or adaptations can be done to certain parts of it, because there is live and ongoing feedback coming from employees who are actually making that change. And then what they do is they keep adapting and building and making that change internally till it sticks. That means till the entire organization has gone through that training process or that change process. So this particular model of how change can be introduced in the organization was introduced by Cotter, John Cotter, in 1995, and this model is called the 8-step model of change, which was introduced by Cotter. The other model that
Yeah.
we talk about is Kurt Levin's, model, 3-step model. So he came up with an idea when obviously he came from Germany to America in the 1930s, and he was basically the founder of social psychology as a subject, and he introduced this concept that when change has to be introduced in the organization, there are 3 phases through which the organization goes by making that change. The first part is the organization needs to freeze where it is in that position when they are looking at making the change. Then at some stage, it will start introducing the change as a process. And then once the process is fully implemented, the organization would unfreeze to ensure that the process starts working. And this 3-step model of change is called the Kurt Levin's 3-step model, which is called unfreeze, change, and freeze. Because once the process has been introduced and the change is accepted, that is then adapted throughout the organization. There is no going back, and that is becoming the norm or the standard operating norm for that particular organization. So, changes he proposed was to be done in three steps. First is unfreeze, understand the stages of it, how it needs to be done, what are the changes required, who would introduce that change, and how would we prepare the organization to accept that change. Now, once the unfreezing has happened, then unfreezing means the processes will be fluid. Policies would change. They would be open to changes, getting feedback, changing the policy. And at some stage, once this policy has been agreed on, everybody's input has been taken, feedback has been incorporated, then the process of change in terms of implementation of that change will happen. That's the second part. And the third part is once that has been done, everybody sings from the same songbook, everybody understands the policy and why the change has been done. Then you freeze it or refreeze it, because that would mean that now going forward from this date, this cutoff date, this is the new process. Everybody follows it, everybody has been trained, everybody knows why this has been done. And this three-step process actually allows the change to be adapted and accepted by everyone in the organization. So this model is now also very recognized. And obviously, when we do talk about this change model, Levin's model emphasizes on the importance of perception and reinforcement of these three stages that the company should follow when they want to look at doing this change. An example of this I would
Yes.
give you is as an example, like Marks and Spencer, they introduced Plan A, which was a sustainability plan introduced by Sir Stuart Rhodes, their chairman, in 2014. And he made a 10-year plan to say that Marks and Spencer would reduce packaging, reduce waste going to landfills, reuse some of the materials that it is using to produce, clothes and other things that it sells in the market. And what it did was, in that plan, it included employees to actively, it basically pushed the employees to actively participate in that plan. So, what we can see in the Kurt Levin's plan is one, the management produced the plan first, which is first part. They looked at understanding
Okay.
the challenges in the market, that there
Yeah.
was a requirement coming from government, the legislation and regulatory changes to look at reducing waste from large retailers like Marks and Spencer, and they recognized this. So the management looked at saying, okay, we need to relook at our practices. That was unfreezing. Then, when we look at understanding the reasons why this was required, legislation, consumer expectation, and last but not the least, how this would be implemented within the organization, they looked at what is called the second stage, which was introduction of change, so that everyone, their suppliers, their partners, their contractors, their consumers, everyone understood why this change was being done. And then this process started to go, and they gave a timeline of 10 years for this change to be introduced, because it's not something which can happen overnight. Marks and Spencer has operation in 10 different countries. It has billions of customers. It has billions of pounds in revenue. It has lots of different types of products and services it produces. So across the company, if this had to be done, this required planning and a timeline. And that was all the actual part of the second step of this change, which is transition as per the Kurt Lewin model. And now that they have achieved this in 2024, what has happened is the organization has gone to the third stage, which is refreezing. And that means they are now reinforcing their practices through support mechanisms of employing new technology to introduce recycling, reuse of material, increasing or introducing efficient machines to look at manufacturing, and ensuring that when new employees join, their training includes training on Plan A, which is sustainability plan of Marks and Spencer, which every employee in the company has to sign off when they join the organization as a pledge. And this is an example of how long-term integration of sustainable practices has been done by using the Kurt Lewin model in Marks and Spencer. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good stuff. So the last part that we want to look at is explaining, some of the considerations that companies have to look at when they look at adapting change within the organization. And this is specifically in respect to a technological example. That means emerging technologies, the unit that we are studying. So when we do look at this process of adapting to emerging technologies, which can help the organization drive growth and, say, for example, help the organization to improve its efficiency, revenues, turnover, and gain a competitive advantage. What we want to be able to understand is how can such change within the organization help it to reduce operational, financial, and ethical risk in the long term by using technologies in the organization. So, an example of this that I would look at would be that when organizations fail to recognize that they have to look at these risks, which could be risks that government is introducing. Now, as you can see, the automobile industry is every 2 or 3 years they have to now conform to what are called the Euro emission norms. So currently on automobiles, the catalytic converter or things like that as a technology, because it's automotive technology that we're talking about as an example. Here, all cars have to have catalytic converters, which means that when the car actually burns fossil fuels, it releases carbon dioxide instead of carbon monoxide. And today we follow what is called the Euro emissions norm 6. So all cars being produced by all manufacturers in Europe, if they have to be sold, they have to comply with that particular norm. Now, if there's a car manufacturing company in India or China or an emerging market which does not follow this norm, their cars cannot be sold in the European market. Now,
Yeah.
this is a problem which we need to look at as an example that why do companies need to make these considerations and adapt to technologies if they want to reach newer markets. So companies like Daewoo, Hyundai, Proton, some of the car manufacturers like Nissan, which are in the emerging markets, if they do not comply and meet with the Euro emission norms of automotive industry in Europe, that means they cannot sell their cars in Europe. So in such cases, what you are going to see is that these companies would need to embrace emerging technology. Even if they don't have the technology within the company, they have to speak to somebody. They have to, buy this technology from a competitor or any other company which is providing it, integrate it in their model, and then be able to sell the cars in in such countries. So
Yeah.
there are lots of different types of considerations which companies would need to look at in order to address some of these demands for a particular geography or a market if they have to sell. So, one such requirement could be organizational compatibility. That means they would need to embrace emerging technologies, although they are not producing it, they are not innovating, they are not inventing it. But because the technology has been invented by somebody else, they would need to license it or they might need to, subcontract it. And that would allow the company to adapt to this change, which is required from the market point of view, and then allow them to sell their products in the market. So an example of other type of technological change which they have to look at embracing would be, I would say, an example would be, say, use of different types of technology. Now, an example that I would give you here would be, say, for example, Tesco a couple of years back, had tills, and obviously they were doing a lot of tilling on the products when consumers were shopping in the stores. But when they introduced the club card system, the reason why they wanted to introduce this club card is they wanted to track what consumers are buying. You go to a normal grocery store, they also have what is called a POS, point of sale machine. Whatever you buy, they scan quickly. It helps in maintaining inventory. It helps to update the prices, and it also allows you to get a receipt at the end of the day. That's a very small example. But
Yeah.
if you now look at it at a bigger scale, Tesco has 4,000 stores in the UK. They want to get all the data coming centrally into their head office. How many consumers are buying, what each store is selling, how much inventory each store has. Now, in such cases, if it does not deploy intelligent point of sale machines or IPOSs that are connected centrally to the server in the head office, then there is no way they would be able to replenish inventory in a particular store. They would not know that in this store the milk is finished or eggs are finished or reordering needs to happen. Now, if they do not look at investing into, I would say, checkout systems or integrated POS-based systems which allow them to connect centrally to the server using internet as an option, then they would be losing out on the business because they will need to do this manually. And if for such a large operation, all this would not be feasible for long
Efficient.
term perspective.
Yeah.
So
It
here,
will be efficient.
it will not be efficient, yes. So in such cases, what they will need to do is basically start looking at technology and integration. That means if I look at 15 years back in Tesco stores, they were regionally structured, right? So what happened was somebody in the region would basically look at in the evening, have a call to say, okay, this is finished, or we have low inventory on this, we need that. So manually it had to be done. But now today their shelving systems are such that it electronically calculates inventory and it automatically sends that data back to the central server. So the planning teams know what dispatch has to be done from central warehousing to replenish the stock in all these stores nationally. Now, this is possible because of technology integration, which Tesco has done in order to streamline its logistics and supply chain, but also its inventory management system. So, considerations why we need to make and upgrade the technology is because the number of consumers coming to our store, the footfall in the store is increasing, the sales are increasing. In order to cope up with the sales and the requirement of the customer demand or consumer demand, we need to replenish stocks, almost every day in some of the stores. Some of the big format stores, they get deliveries every day from the warehouse because it is getting sold out that quickly. But if they don't have that technology integration, it won't be possible for them to, look at replenishing this or, maintaining this in terms of supply and demand from the consumer. So that is what I would suggest you need to look at as an example when we talk about, why does the company need to look at adapting continuously for technology. It is fine that they introduced electronic POS machines in their stores 20 years back or 30 years back, but they were all standalone machines and the store was standalone. But as the time has passed, as you can see, how the integration has happened, how they've done the e-commerce model, you are looking at adapting to emerging technology. So deliveries from these stores, grocery deliveries were not present about 10 years back or 5 years back, essentially. But if I look at 2020, very few people used to order delivery from the store. But because of
Yeah.
COVID, it gave a push and people started ordering online. Now you see deliveries being offered by Iceland. You look at deliveries being offered by, Sainsbury's, by Asda, by Aldi, by everybody's, having deliveries. That means you can buy online and that means they can deliver to you on the same day the groceries to your house. Now, this is basically emerging adaptation of emerging demand of the consumer, substituting it with technology which allows them to calculate inventory, which store will be able to supply or service that order, and that allows the company to essentially get more business. Is that okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Good
Clear
stuff. So
everything.
my suggestion to you would be to look at, obviously going through some of the bits here on, the references that are additional reading articles for this particular learning outcome, and a few of them that I've shown you on Moodle, which are there, which would essentially allow you to, look at maybe doing a bit more reading on some of the assessment criteria we have covered.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Rahman.
Good stuff. So we will meet up tomorrow with regards to, obviously continuing with the next learning outcome.
Yeah.
I'll send you the meeting codes and I'll also upload the presentations for learning outcome 4 and 5. So you have a bit of reading to do on this learning outcome. There are some articles in PDF which I've given, and then some articles which I've given here, which I would suggest to read, like the Harvard Business Review on implementation of new technology. There's a case study on rapid technological change and challenges and opportunities, and then the 5-step change methodology, which has been employed by an organization by taking the change management models that we've discussed.
Yeah. If I
Okay.
have any questions, I can call you. I can email you through Rahman at
Versity.
ukuniversity.com.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Good stuff.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank
Shaima,
you,
thanks
Mr.
for
Omar.
joining in today, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank, thank you. See you
Take
tomorrow.
care.